Normally, cultures change through evolution, a trial and error process and a very slow process. But for this process to work effectively, there must be a large cultural gene pool. Cultural standardization is the antithesis of this. The rational penetrations in cultural design that I am proposing as now possible and essential will shortcut the evolutionary trial and error process. It is an aggressive stance vis-a-vis evolution. It is an attempt to hold off final judgment, our selection out, while we correct our ways. Evolution usually goes down a one-way street. I am apprehensive of such shortcutting. It may be hard to balance, like suddenly shifting a big weight in a boat, but I suspect that it may actually be a shift to bring the unbalanced world back into balance. Its counterweight being all of the cultural shortcoming of the past 200 years. Besides, the graphs of the limits to growth tell us that time is short and shortcutting may be appropriate to the times. How to go about cultural redesign? Where can we start? We have been very fortunate in the last 15 years to have suddenly discovered a tremendous amount about non-cultural man. That is, man the animal, before evolution begins, or human nature. We have always designed for animal man in his physical dimensions, his height, his reach, his temperature, comfort range. Now, to a very limited extent, we can design for man in his behavioral dimensions. We know that man is territorial, aggressive, cooperative with those he considers of his group, fearful and antagonistic toward strangers to his group. Most of these psychological aspects will not be considered specifically by this book, partially because they cannot yet be easily quantified. Rather, we will provide the information to design for the animal man in his physical dimensions. The point, however, is that our knowledge of the animal man can act as an ultimate net to break our cultural fall. Perhaps we will never have to go that far down. We will try first to clutch at usable cultural branches, but we will accept as fact that the animal man has an ingrained instinctual limit to the amount of centralization he can sustain indefinitely. First, then, in the process of cultural design of domestic architecture, we will consider location or site and glean from it its demands and limitations. Next, we will consider the inhabitants or inhabitants-to-be of that location and glean from them their animal demands and limitations, and such of their cultural demands and limitations as appear to be permanently balanceable with the location. An example of an unbalanceable cultural demand would be one that required the consumption, Roger, not today, of fossil fuels at a rate faster than they are being deposited. Sorry. In accepting cultural demands, we will be extremely cautious of aesthetic demands, since aesthetic demands in domestic architecture usually represent complete cultural traditions, mixed or unmixed. For example, the aesthetic insistence on a Cape Cod cottage allows no room for rational design. And a client who could not release himself from that aesthetic tradition would have to confront the future as best he can, defended by it. Aesthetically, our preferred approach will be form follows function. And so we would prefer to design with as few preconceptions related to form as possible. We believe that form follows function is the effect of evolution's approach to design, although evolution is of course based on preconceptions. If, following the evolutionary process, we keep our preconceptions at this time, we may not be able to shortcut, and we run a strong chance of being selected out as trials that proved errors. It is, of course, entirely possible that the demands of a location and the demands of a culture may prove ultimately incompatible and unbalanceable, as the USA is proving, in which case one of the two will have to change. Once we have all the demands and limitations of location and inhabitant, we will set about, by as purely rational a process as possible, to design a physical plant that can combine the two optimally. In this process, we will not automatically shy away from modern technology. Rather, we will gladly use the most modern technologies as long as they can safely be decentralized, a limitation which may deny us the use of 90% of them. A technology that establishes continuing dependence on a centralized system like electric heat, we will not use. One that does not, like reinforced concrete, we may. As in Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion, we will try to get the most out of technology, but only under the strict regimen of what is balanceable and what is not. We will use our liberation from traditional aesthetics to let rational design run free. We will probably break many aesthetic rules in the process, but we will entrust ourselves completely to form follows function, to give us a pleasing result. If the result is not pleasing, we will first turn a suspicious eye on the function, and secondly on ourselves for not finding it pleasing. We will design in wholes, decentralized wholes to be sure. Our minimum unit will include no less than all the systems required to support a client's culture on a given location. I've got Wedge's paradigm here again. Thus, we could not design a house without consideration of a garden or a barn or a hen house. In fact, these very terms represent cultural assumptions we will not make. Though the building schedule may include a delay of 10 years for reasons of finance between the construction of a house and the construction of a barn, nonetheless, we would design both together. This is quite the contrary of building and design practice in early New England, where building was stuck onto building as required, an admirable practice for those materially and culturally wealthy times. We will design our spaces not as isolated components, but as interrelated components, sharing walls, heating systems, windbreaks, and spaces themselves whenever possible, always looking for double functions. We will ask ourselves, how is playing one-hoop basketball like winnowing grain? And answer that both need a clean, hard surface of similar size. The reader has probably noticed how playing basketball is like driving cars into garages. The coming use of the technology of heating buildings by solar radiation is a good example of the advantages to be gained by incorporating house and heating plant into one, rather than sticking a solar collector onto a Cape Cod cottage. Perhaps it appears to the reader that we may place undue importance on the physical plant. We do, in fact, regard it as the most important criterion for the success or failure of a given lifestyle. Inappropriate domestic architecture can break a would-be self-sufficient unit or take much of the joy out of it. The sacrifice of central heat, for example, where through appropriate design it could have been included as part of a balanceable culture. Although aesthetic trips, quote-unquote, have been tolerated and even approved of in the recent construction of simple houses, they can be disastrous to the intricate interplay of systems in a homestead. The tradition-free design of houses is fraught with other kinds of dangers. As John Coles, editor of the Maine Times, points out in an article, architect friends tell me many divorces follow in the wake of home building decisions by otherwise compatible couples. I now understand why. Because if you really think about the house you want to live in, you must begin to decide who you are. In the case of the troubled couples, neither knew himself, herself, or the other until the trauma of home planning time. Just as a homestead is an enormously more complicated design problem than a house, the traumatic decision-making is much more extensive. Fortunately, the demands of ecological balance are such that they can handle a tremendous amount of the decision-making on their own. Finally, we will give great importance to the design of the physical plant because the capital investment merits it. The construction or purchase of a house is usually the largest single capital investment an individual or family makes. If there is anything that merits custom design, it is a homestead. A homestead may be thought of in its entirety as a tool to fashion from a certain volume of the biosphere a certain human lifestyle. The tool's design is a large factor in determining how well and easily it can perform the task. And there I will stop.